Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the business of sports.
The business of sports can be intimidating or hard for a starter to break into.
We really appreciate when our owners are actually there, with us through the journey.
Teams, ours especially, have been very intentional to diversify at all levels of the company.
I think we're in the golden years for the NFL and college football.
Our demographic reach has continued to expand.
This is going to be really unlocking the streaming platform for sports fans.
Sports valuations are rising. We'll see when they peak.
You don't have to be the best in your sport to make a whole ton of money.
Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio.
Hi, and welcome to the Bloomberg Business of Sports, where we explore the big money issues in the world of sports. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Vanessa Perdomo.
Yep, you're hearing it right. The regular crew, Michael Barr, Scarlett Fu, and Damian Sassower, they're not here. We're taking over.
We took your show.
They're going to be back next week. Anyway, coming up on the show, we'll get you ready for the national championship game between Notre Dame and Ohio State down in Atlanta. We're going to chat with Dan Corso. He's the president of the Atlanta Sports Council.
The state capitol and all the legislators are all excited about it. They're a little bummed that UGA, the Bulldogs, are not in it, understandably, but they see the value and the impact that having a matchup like Ohio State and Notre Dame is going to have, not just on the city of Atlanta and the region, but the entire state.
We'll also talk with Chafie Fields. He's executive vice president for team sports at Wasserman, a sports marketing and talent management firm.
He was an amazing college football player. He has some big thoughts on the college game, the pro game, and how they're basically the same thing.
You have some individuals in this year's draft class that have been in 4 colleges, so they don't even feel a part of anything. It's just, I'm a hired hit, and I'm going to go to whoever's going to pay me the most money to play.
Anyway, all that is on the way on the Bloomberg Business of Sports show. We wanted to start with a special conversation. Joined now by Chafie Davidson, our former colleague and someone that Vanessa and I have both done some work with over the years. She's an Emmy-winning journalist, host of the Sportly podcast, which I have to say, you got to jump on this. It's so good, so rich in detail and reporting and voice. Chafie, really, really good to have you back with us.
So good to be with you guys again. And it's been a couple of years, but, you're always part of the Bloomberg family, aren't you?
Oh, you never leave. Come on. You know better. So let's talk about the pod a little bit. Sportly, I did a deep dive on it, listened to a bunch of episodes. It's pickleball, it's ping pong, it's Formula One, and I think very close to Vanessa's in my heart, the WNBA, a lot of women's sports stuff, which we know you've covered closely. Give us the log line. Like, what are you trying to accomplish with this pod?
Yeah, so this is really a project that I'm extremely passionate about because, I'm a kid from New York City. My parents are immigrants, so I'm a first-gen kid. And I never really realized how much that impacted my sports fandom. Like, I just grew up a Knicks and Rangers and Yankees fan in the northern part of Manhattan. But when I started doing this professionally, as the columnist with you guys more than 10 years ago now, geez, I started to realize that, I kind of see sports slightly differently. And then there are ways that I just see sports as a New Yorker, right? But that my background does impact some of the things. Like, my parents are not American sports fans. They are now that I do this for a living. But, that's not where I got my fandom from. And, my connection to my city and my classmates and things like that. So I think what we're trying to do with Sportly is tell some of those stories, right? Both from the perspective of third culture kids and, kids of immigrants and also immigrants themselves. And also, just talk about sports as they are today in America from that perspective. And, we're part of this, our parent company is Immigrantly Media. And Immigrantly is, they've got a few podcasts, I think 5 right now. And the point is that, we've got like 70 million first and second generation immigrants in America. And we're only ever really called on to talk about politics or like what's happening at the border. And obviously that's important. And we should be talking about that. But we also want to talk about food and culture and sports. And I think that's what we're really trying to do with this pod from both a current and a historical perspective.
All right, let's talk about women's sports, because one of the best episodes I think that you did is about the WNBA. You did it on the heels of the Liberty finally winning the championship. You are a avowed, diehard Liberty fan.
I was at the parade. It was one of the best days. It's been a
was
while
awesome.
since I've been able to go to the Canyon of Heroes, but it was amazing.
I mean, the Clara Wu side of it all, the Ellie of it all, the fans in the stands. I mean, it really was a pretty incredible moment, and I think notable that the last two championships that the city of New York has celebrated have been in women's soccer and women's basketball in consecutive years, Gotham, and then, of course, the Liberty. You raise a question at the end of that episode that I would love to get into with you, which is what happens next? What needs to happen in order for all these gains to be locked in and sustainable? What do you think? I mean, put your Bloomberg experience to work here. What has to happen for this business to be real and to keep growing?
Yeah, so this is obviously something that I've thought about for a while, not to toot my own horn, but I think what we're seeing now with this incredible growth of the W is that there are a lot of new people and new reporters who haven't covered these games or this league coming in. And that's great, but it also means that there's a little bit of a loss of the understanding of the history and the understanding of how the business has changed in the last 10 to 20 years, right? Like I was writing W columns for Bloomberg back in 2013, you know what I mean? But so obviously the most glaring thing right now is upcoming CBA negotiations. The union has opted out of that. And there's this giant influx of money with the new NBA, WNBA TV deal that will hopefully lead to, a restructuring of player salaries, rookie minimums, salary minimums. Rookie minimums were really in the conversation when, obviously, with all of this hype around Caitlin Clark, the average fan realized how little rookies make. And it's not about Caitlin Clark, obviously deserving to make more money than she does, but that's just how the rookie minimum is set in the W. And that's a function of basketball related income, as it is with every CBA, right? So I think that those negotiations are going to be really interesting to see. You've seen Kathy Engelbert kind of keep in her Deloitte mindset, which is we're as a league in a growth mentality. So
this is the
labor part of it.
The WNBA commissioner,
WNBA commissioner, yes. Who has a Deloitte background and came from there. And she has very much run the W like a business like that. And it's obviously been wildly successful. She's had some really innovative sponsorship deals, and the way that, she's thought about marketing this league in particular have been really impactful for the league. But there's going to be some contention between the player side, between the union and the league about how much growth is too much too quickly, right? And this often happens with leagues. If you look at the major men's American sports leagues in the first 50 years, there were strikes and labor stoppages and everything like that. And I think the hope is that there's no labor stoppage here. And I think both sides would like to continue this momentum, because that would really kill a lot of what we've seen in the last 5 years. But there is a question about fair compensation given the popularity of this league and these players now, given their marketability with social media, and given things like Unrivaled and Athletes Unlimited, and the fact that, Brittany Griner being in Russia really highlighted the fact that even at the top of their game, Diana Taurasi and Brittany Griner and Breanna Stewart can't really afford not to play abroad or to play during the off season, right? So those are going to be huge conversations that we're going to be having leading up to those negotiations. And then beyond that, it's just how we can continue this very steady growth, because obviously we've seen an immense amount of popularity boom from Caitlin Clark. Like the Caitlin Clark effect is real, and we can't kid ourselves to say that it's not. But it did also happen at the right time. It happened at a time of sustained growth in ratings and viewership and ticket sales and sponsorship deals in the last 5 years. And I think the question is about continuing that and making sure that people understand just how good this product is. Like we're all talking about declining ratings in the NBA and whether the style of basketball has something to do with that. And if that is the reason that you are not watching the NBA, go watch fundamental physical basketball in the W, because it's happening there.
And some logo threes that are just, breathtaking. exciting. Yeah, and one of the things that I think is so notable, and I really commend that WNBA episode to everybody if you want to understand the history, because as you say, Chafie, there is a real lack of understanding about the long history of it. And you also, take head on this idea of, let's say the quiet part out loud, that one of the reasons Caitlin Clark blew up is because she's a white girl from the Midwest. And, one of the reasons that this has been sidelined as a product, and I'm quoting here, you said, quote, there's also, sexism. And so these are real things that sort of factor into all of this, Vanessa.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, when we're going ahead into the next chapter of women's sports, like you're saying, do we finally get past that with those questions that were really, really prominent last year? If last year was, 2024, I feel like will probably be going down in history as the year of women's sports. So what will 2025 really be, do you think, Vita?
Yeah, I mean, obviously 2024 between the W and all of the amazing moments in the Olympics and everything that we saw with investment. We're seeing Silicon Valley really get into investing in women's sports. One, because they see the growth potential, and two, because really to buy into a major men's team right now as an owner, there are very few people in the country, let alone in the world, who have that kind of net worth. But it's going to be interesting to see how some of these less established and, let's say, smaller sports do benefit from that, right? And I think if you talk to a lot of analysts, women's volleyball is on the docket. Alexis Ohanian held a women's track and field tournament in New York City right after the Olympics, trying to, for years we've been talking about how we can take the excitement around certain women's sports that get generated by the Olympics and sustain that throughout the year instead of just having it happen every 4 years. And I think we're going to start seeing more of that because, frankly, and this was the point that I made in almost every column I wrote for Bloomberg about women's sports, there is so much money to be made, right, and money has just been left on the table because of either small c conservatism and not wanting to invest in the product or not thinking that women's sports is sustainable. But I think and I hope that we're past that moment where this is clearly not a fad.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great note to end on. And we really, really enjoyed catching up with you. Chafie Davidson, Emmy-winning journalist, host of the Sportly podcast. You got to follow it. It is a must listen every week because you get the historical perspective, the current perspective, and also, as you just heard from Chafie, some really nice forward-looking elements as well. So congratulations on all your success and look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks, Chafie.
Thank you. This is great.
Up next, we turn to football with the NFL playoffs in full swing and college football's national championship game coming up on Monday. For Vanessa Perdomo, I'm Jason Kelly. You're listening to the Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio around the world.
This is Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio.
This is the Bloomberg Business of Sports, where we explore the big money issues in the world of sports. I'm Jason Kelly alongside Vanessa Perdomo. Michael Barr, Scarlett Fu, and Damian Sassower will be back next week. We're joined now by Chafie Fields. He's the Executive Vice President for Team Sports at Wasserman, one of the best-known sports agencies out there. Chafie, really good to be with you. We have so much to get into here. You played college ball, you played pro ball, and we're joking before we came on the air. There's nothing happening in football right now. It's such an exciting time. What do you make of how it's going so far in the college and NFL ranks at this moment?
Interesting, man. I think it's very exciting at this point, man, both in college and professional football. I mean, starting with college, being the first year for the playoff system and just seeing how it's played out, man, it's been very exciting. And it's good to see finally that you allow it to play out on the field, versus just naming someone as national champion or just picking a couple of teams, allowing them to play it out, man. I think it's better to allow these teams to play it out, earn the opportunity to play in a national championship, and earn a right to win and be decided on the field. And so I think it's really exciting.
And so, one of the things we wanted to dig into with you was, I think it's fair to say, there are really blurred lines between the business of college football and the business of pro football at this point. Again, you played at both levels and you represent players on both sides. Take us through the business of college football at this moment. What is the most meaningful thing that's happened in terms of how players get paid, where they decide to play? What are the conversations you're having with your clients around that?
It's really not that big of a difference at this point.
Really?
Right? So I think that with the NIL and the transfer portal, college football has almost become professional football. Mm-hmm. You know, the transfer portal is like free agency. Mm-hmm. You know, these young men have the opportunity to make a decision at the end of every season if they're going to stay or if they're going to go. And they do so, the majority of them, based upon who's going to compensate them the greatest. And so I don't personally feel like that's the best decision in all cases. I think that at the end of the day, for the majority of these young men, the end goal is still to get the opportunity to play professional football. And so sometimes chasing a dollar amount doesn't necessarily put you in the best case scenario for your future. And so I think a lot of these young men are making terrible decisions, just basing those decisions off of monetary value versus what team and what school and what university gives them the best opportunity to reach their full potential and ultimately play professional football.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point that you're speaking about there. And I one of the things I was going to ask you, and I was really interested about, was almost like you said, it's free agency almost at the end of every year. So it almost seems like they're the same, but almost do college players have more of a control over their career than people in the NFL?
College players absolutely have more control. I mean, think of it this way. Every college coach has to now not just recruit high school players and try to convince individuals out of the portal to come to their school, but they have to re-recruit the players on their team to stay. You know, it creates a real issue. But then it's also, for example, for me, I played college football at Penn State. And under the amazing, iconic Coach Joe Paterno. And Coach Joe Paterno was such a mainstay that if you played at Penn State in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, if you came back in the 90s or 2000s, you were welcome like it was your home.
Right.
It was a tradition. It was an understanding. It was a standard. It was a culture that will never exist again. It can't. You know, you have some individuals in this year's draft class that have been in 3 colleges, 4 colleges, so they don't even feel a part of anything. It's just, you know, I'm a hired hit, and I'm going to go to whoever's going to pay me the most money to play. And it's terrible for college, and it's also not necessarily very good for these young men either. That doesn't mean that I'm against the players being compensated,
right.
But I think there has to be a better way to do it.
So what is the better way? Because that you went right where we wanted to go, Chafie, which is how would you fix the system, or how would you change it so that the players get paid, everybody continues to make the money that they want to make, and yet there is that consistency, culturally and for the schools and candidly, like for the students and the alumni of those schools. Like, what would you do to change it?
I'll take it back to my experience in college, right? When I was playing college football, if you transferred, you would have to sit out a full season.
Right.
If you transferred in conference, you would have to sit out 2 full seasons, right? And so it wasn't going to be a situation where you were just going to jump every year and jump into the portal because there was consequences. And you couldn't just leave the team high and dry, and vice versa. Now, I think 2 years is extreme, but if there was some type of circumstances or consequences that if you went into the portal and not for a valid reason, just because you want to go get more money, then there should be some type of consequence to you leaving, right? But currently, as it stands, you can just leave because you want to leave. I don't feel like this team is going to give me this much money. They're going to give me more, so I'm leaving.
Right. Or the coach hurt my feelings, or I don't like this guy that I'm playing with.
Not the coach hurt my feelings. I just showed up yesterday, and I'm on a second team. That's not fair.
Right.
I'm leaving.
Right. And do you feel like it's going to set that sort of mindset would then set up, college players for an unsuccessful professional career if that's, what they're used to feeling like?
Not only does it set you up for an unsuccessful professional career, it sets you up for unsuccessful life because you think that everything is just going to go your way. You don't have to work for it. You don't have to put any time in. You don't have to make any sacrifices. You just get what you want, and you get it right now.
And so, Chafie, talk to us about the conversations you're then having with these players, because you're having to have these hard business conversations that are about their careers, about their incomes. What's the advice that you're giving them when they come to work with you or they come to work with Wasserman?
For me, again, it's not just about college football or basketball. It's about life, right? And how every decision that you make today affects your life tomorrow. And so for me, a lot of times, and a lot of parents today, if you think these young men think about the dollars and cents, you should see some of the parents.
Oh, I bet.
It's gotten really bad. And so a lot of times those families that want what's best for their children, they understand and they want to do it the right way. But then you have the alternative where they don't care, because a lot of the times these young men are now taking care of their families. They're the main breadwinners in their family, right? And so the family just wants more. They want to get as much as they can. And it's not necessarily, again, the best decision for the young man.
Right. So do you feel
doesn't always work out in my favor?
Right. Yeah, that's right. I'm trying to does that make it your job almost even harder? I mean, Jason and I have talked to a lot of athletes who are now in the business sector, and they have this unique experience, and you would think that obviously that makes your job easier because you can connect with them better, but then at the same time, you're kind of laying it down a little harsh for them, trying to get them to understand life, not just the sports and money of it. So does that make your job a little bit harder?
Absolutely does. However, for me, more importantly, I want to be able to sleep well at night, right? And so while a lot of others, I won't say most, I'll just say a lot of others tend to simply sell and tell these young men and their families what they want to hear, I want to tell you and educate you what you need to hear. And whether you accept it or not, I know I'm doing the right thing. I know I'm trying to help you. And so whether you decide to go in another direction because you're hearing something different or better at the moment, I know I can sleep well at night because I did right by you guys and your family. And so it's easier for me to just continue to do it the right way. And again, it doesn't always work out in my favor, but 8 times out of 10, they always circle back.
Yeah. And so, Chafie, but before we let you go, I mean, we'd love to understand what the impact is then on the NFL. I mean, we have a recent example of Carson Beck, playing for the University of Georgia, declares for the draft, then basically says, actually, never mind, I'm going to go play another year in college. That would have been unheard of, obviously, in your era. So what happens then at the NFL level with players maybe staying longer in college, making more money in college? Does that fundamentally, and how does it, if it does, fundamentally change the business of pro football?
Yes and no, right? So, and let's use Carson as an example here. Carson would be able to make significantly more money in college than he would have if he were to enter the draft this year.
Wow.
And so from a business perspective for him, it made sense because if I stay, I'll probably make 2 to 3 times more than I would make if I went to the NFL. And here's the thing, every position and every situation and circumstance is different, right?
Sure.
And as a quarterback in particular, it behooves you to get drafted as high as possible so that you can get the opportunity to play.
Right.
Right. If you're not a first-round pick as a quarterback, chances are, you're going to have to sit and wait for an opportunity to present itself, which a lot of times doesn't happen. And so for him, if he's not going to be an early first-round pick, then it just makes sense for him to go back to school and get compensated handsomely. He's a professional football player. He'll be a pro, without a doubt.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, last note for you. You don't have a rooting interest, I think, directly in the game on Monday, but I believe you have a client playing, so all OSU for you?
Baby.
So let me say this. About this client. this client that you speak of is Jeremiah Smith, who, in my opinion, is the best college football player in the country at this point.
Wow.
And he's a freshman, right? He's the most dynamic wide receiver that I've ever seen at this age. I've never seen a young man at this stage and this age as dynamic as this kid. He's so different, man. He's fun to watch and a joy to work with because he's so focused. With all that being said, I'm going to have to pull, and it's hard for me to say it as a Penn State guy. It's so hard for me to say it, but I'm gonna go with Ohio State.
I know. I was gonna say that must. That's a tough one. Yeah. That's a tough one. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure catching up with you. Thank you so much. Chafie Fields is Executive Vice President, Team Sports for Wasserman, former standout at Penn State University, and yet he's rooting for Ohio State. Really good to spend some time with you. Thanks, Chafie.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Chafie.
Up next, we head to Atlanta, host site of Monday's college football championship game. We're going to talk with Dan Corso, president of the Atlanta Sports Council. For Vanessa Perdomo, I'm Jason Kelly. You're listening to the Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio around the world.
This is Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio.
Thanks so much for joining us here on the Bloomberg Business of Sports, where we explore the big money issues in the world of sports. I'm Jason Kelly alongside Vanessa Perdomo, your usual host, Michael Barr, Scarlett Fu, Damian Sassower. They will be back next week. Well, the first ever 12-team college football playoff wraps up on Monday at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in my hometown of Atlanta. Notre Dame Fighting Irish versus the Ohio State Buckeyes. Here to talk about how Atlanta is prepping for the big game, we welcome Dan Corso. He is the president of the Atlanta Sports Council. He has put together an unbelievable tapestry, I should say, I think, Vanessa, of folks who are putting on together. I mean, it's the equivalent of a Super Bowl. If you're in college football, you care about college football, this is the Super Bowl, the national championship, the first ever of the 12-game playoff. No small feat, Dan. Really good to have you with us. You're at the state capitol. You've been, making the rounds, hanging out with the governor and all the top brass in the Georgia state government. People pretty excited about this because there's a lot of money coming into Georgia over this, right?
Yeah, Jason, Vanessa, thanks for having me on. Yeah, we're really excited. I was just mentioning before we started the state capitol, and all the legislators are all excited about it. They're a little bummed that UGA, the Bulldogs, are not in it, understandably, but they see the value and the impact that having a matchup like Ohio State and Notre Dame is going to have, not just on the city of Atlanta and the region, but the entire state. I mean, this is going to be a statewide economic impact for sure. And just having two great brands like that coming to our state, matching off in the championship game here in Atlanta. And quite honestly, we're really proud in the fact that we're the first repeat city of this great event. So the CFP had a lot of options to go for 2025, and they called us and we made it work out. So we're excited to host them again.
Well, we want to talk to you about sort of how it all worked out, because this is a different beast. But before we get to that, I mean, the reality from an economic perspective, I believe, and keep us honest here, is that this is actually a better matchup economically, because you got a lot of people who need to stay in hotel rooms versus if it's Georgia or Alabama, where it's a much more sort of endemic fan base, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, in 2018, our first hosting, we did have Georgia versus Alabama, and those two teams are, obviously have huge fan bases here in the Southeast, but they also matched up that particular year in the SEC football championship.
Right.
So they were coming back a second time. So, but to have a non-regional game, if you will, in that regard, and having two national teams come in, you're opening up new fan bases, right, and new alumni across the country that have perhaps not been to Atlanta in quite some time, or perhaps ever. And so it's an opportunity for us to showcase this community to a whole new audience and a much broader audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get into that a little bit about, you said you're the first repeat host city, and, you're awarded the game in 2022, and then they expand into the 12-team playoffs. Can you tell us a little bit about how this one's different than the first one, if the expansion has anything more of an impact, and how you pivoted from what you had originally planned?
Yeah, Vanessa, it's a good question. I'll give you the exact months. August of 2022, we were officially announced as the host city for the event for 2025. That game date was supposed to be January 6th, Monday. And then in December, to your point, the playoff expanded. It officially announced as an expansion to 12 teams from 4 teams. And because of that expansion, the playoff obviously was extended longer on the calendar, which then pushed our game date back 2 weeks. So a lot of work went into that. Not only are we a great city for hosting big sporting events, we're one of the best out there in the country, but we're also a top 4 convention city. So the conventions use the same things that the big sporting events use, and that's hotel rooms. So we had to quickly get into the idea of, okay, if we're shifting back 2 weeks, how does the hotel capacity look? How does the convention center space look from perhaps a convention standpoint? Because that venue, which is right next door to Mercedes-Benz Stadium, will be used for a lot of the fan events during the event weekend coming up. Thankfully, we were clear, moved a few things around, but nothing too problematic, and we were able to accommodate the due date. But believe me, we were going to find a way to make it happen anyway. So the idea that it expanded from 4 teams to 12 teams, I think added what we said at the very beginning, potential new markets coming in that we might not have seen. Obviously, it increased by 3 times to get to some new teams in the mix. And the idea that, the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl served as a quarterfinal during this expanded playoff back on January 1st. We had Texas versus Arizona State. So now we've got really 2 big parts of the tournament, if you will, calling Atlanta home.
Yeah, I mean, and that was probably the best game of the entire playoff. Maybe leading up to the semifinals, and obviously expecting a good game in the finals coming up on Monday. Dan, I do, and full disclosure, I'm an Atlanta guy, as you know.
I was waiting. I was wondering when you were going to bring that up.
I was waiting for you to bring it up, Jason. I was going to lead off with that, but you didn't. So
spent a lot of my growing up years there. My parents still live there, and one thing I know, and you know as well as anyone, in part because it's part of your family business. Obviously, we all know your legendary dad, or we feel like we know him. College football is probably the number 1 sport in the city of Atlanta. I mean, I'm a big Falcons fan. I'm a big Hawks fan. I'm a big Braves fan. And yet I think if you ask a lot of people what's the number 1 team in the city of Atlanta, it's probably the Georgia Bulldogs, much to the chagrin of my Georgia Tech Yellow Jacket dad. But why is that? And what are the economics of college football, and why have they blossomed so much, and especially there in Atlanta?
I think if you were to take a sport and a city and try to find the best combination that you could out there, it would be college football in Atlanta. It is just something that's historically been within, and you know this, Jason, growing up here, and you referenced it, historically within our DNA. It's part of our culture here. We've got a great lifestyle, a great quality of life, music, food, entertainment, a great region and city and state to do business in. It's a great quality of life from an educational standpoint. But part of that quality of life involves sports and recreation. And college football is just part of it. You're born and raised following college football, and as you said, either Georgia or Georgia Tech for the most part. But we're also a transient city.
Right.
So we've got a lot of expansion of people coming in from all over the nation moving in here as a top 10 populated city. And as college football grows across the country, those fans are bringing those folks moving here are bringing their affinity for college football with them here. So it just continues to grow upon itself, both endemically to the residents here, then also to the visitors that relocate here. So it's an important part of it. I mean, we're a big sports event town. We're a big sports town. We've got a lot of teams, both collegiately and professionally, but college football just seems to resonate. And we've got a lot of games here with the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl, the Celebration Bowl, the SEC Championship, which is like a playoff game every year that calls Atlanta home. And, we have those 3 great sporting events in college football each and every year.
Yeah, I'm curious, when you talk about that and you talk about how important it is to host these big major events and how good you guys are at it and things like that. What makes Atlanta such a good host city, and how important is it to the local economy that you continue to host these major events?
Well, we look at it as a hosting, not just city or downtown Atlanta, where, that's where the competitions are held. And that's where the bulk of our 21,000 hotel rooms, in this case, that are booked for the CFP weekend are located. That's quite a big number. But we look at this as a regional and a statewide hosting. So we engage with the state of Georgia and their tourism department to promote Savannah, Macon, Columbus, Augusta, other really cool parts of this state to the visitors that are coming in, because the visitation is multiple days. And so while there are fan events happening over the weekend, there's other things to do while you've got some downtime, and we try to push tourism to the other parts of the state. So the reason I think we're successful in the effort to get these events to come here and in our hosting is because we've got great venues, starting with Mercedes-Benz Stadium, right? One of the top in the world, and I know you've been there, surrounded by 14,000 hotel rooms that are all in walking distance to the stadium. So you know better than anybody when you travel to an event, whether it's sports or cultural or anything else, you fly into the airport, you get your ride share to your hotel, and you hope just to be able to not get in another vehicle until you go back to the airport. That's the case here in Atlanta. That's how our setup here is in Atlanta. It's very user-friendly. Mm-hmm. And that user-friendliness for the fans becomes very friendly for the organizers as well, CFP, FIFA, NFL, NCAA, whatever the case may be. So I think the connection of how compact our footprint is, with the venues and the hospitality areas, the restaurants, the bars, the attractions, surrounded by 14,000 hotel rooms and the world's busiest airport to get everyone here, that combination is really tough to beat.
So, Dan, before we let you go, I mean, I want to go a little off script here and just talk about, what a fascinating job you have, because you're not only dealing with college football, you've got the All-Star Game, MLB coming up. You've got the, FIFA World Club Cup coming up this summer. Obviously, the World Cup coming up in 2026. You're going to have a Super Bowl, et cetera. How does that work? Do you just are you just constantly kind of parallel tracking all these different sports? How do you pull all this together?
Well, we do it with really good partnerships. And, I do run the Atlanta Sports Council. It's my 25th year with the organization. It's been a great run. I consider this an honor and a position. It's not a job. There's only one of its kind here in the city, and I take it very seriously, and I'm very honored to have it. We've got a great staff. We're lean and mean as a nonprofit, but we have an extension to our small staff of 5 by partnering with the stadium, the city, the ACVB, which is our hospitality community, and other partners, and utilize their staffs to come in and help us organize these big sporting events. And I think that model creates a sense of real engagement and collaboration. All the stakeholders are involved. All of their full-time staffers are involved.
Well, Dan, it's been really, really good talking to you. Last question before we go. I have to ask you, as you look ahead to this national championship, as you said, 2 blue bloods. We know a certain very famous sportscaster is either going to, don his leprechaun outfit or put his Buckeye hat on. Do you have a prediction?
Well, I know his prediction, but I'm not going to share it with you. And only one Corso gets paid to make predictions, and I'll leave it there.
Well, that's great. Well, we'll look forward to that. Thanks so much,
Thank
Dan
you.
Corso, president of the Atlanta Sports Council, the busiest man around, getting ready to host a whole host of big events this coming week and on and on and on for the city of Atlanta. Really good to spend some time with you.
Thank you for having me, guys.
And thank you for joining us. For Vanessa Perdomo, I'm Jason Kelly. Don't forget to catch our podcast. Subscribe now on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Tune in again next week when Michael, Scarlett, and Damien, they're bringing it back, and they'll take you through the latest on the stories moving big money in the world of sports. You're listening to Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio around the world.